Euthanasia is being offered as a form of compassion, an act of mercy. But is it really? We'll talk about that and more in this edition of Life Matters with Brian Johnston, Western Regional Director of the National Right to Life Committee. Brian Johnston is the Western Director of the National Right to Life Committee. He has served in many capacities while advocating for innocent lives, as California Commissioner on Aging, as Chairman of the California Pro-Life Council, on the board of the National Legal Center for the Medically Dependent and Disabled. And now here's our host, Brian Johnston.
Well, welcome back to Life Matters. I'm your host, Brian Johnston. And remember, this is your program on life, culture, and the very real battle of ideas. And there's a battle raging, and it is a battle over human lives. So you've got to be aware of it. If you're not aware of this battle, you will succumb, and your loved ones. So we're here to prepare you and to arm you and to give you the tools you need to be effective in this battle. I'm very pleased today. We have a good friend, Nancy Valko, who's a registered nurse, but she has a lot more experience than just that. Let me give you a little bit of her background. She's been a registered nurse since 1969, and she's the spokesperson for the National Association of Pro-Life Nurses. She's also past president of Missouri Nurses for Life and past chair of the St. Louis Respect Life Committee. She's received many awards regarding ethics and medical ethics, and she's worked in critical care, hospice, home health, oncology, dialysis, and other specialties for 45 years. And she's a legal nurse consultant. A lot more things I could tell you about her. I've come across her through her writings, which are incisive and powerful, because she's been there and she has seen this. And I want you to hear from her because she's on the front lines. Nancy, it is so good to have you on.
Thank you, Brian, for having me.
One of the things we've talked about in the past, and I know we're going to have you out here in California in November at our conference, Caring, Not Killing, but we have to recognize with the change in the law and the change in medicine, there's something happening to our culture that people may not realize. The idea of suicide has now been approved by many states. As long as you're in a certain condition, suicide is a good thing, and in any states, the state will even pay for you to be killed, whether it's at your hand or really through an assistant. Because remember, this is about assisted suicide. Now, I've written about this before, but Nancy, you have seen this up close many ways. There's a real concern about suicide contagion. Let's talk a little bit about the contagious nature of suicide.
Well, there's actually two different kinds of contagion. One that I talk about a lot because of my personal experience is they have had a study, particularly in 2015, where they looked at the states of Oregon and Washington to determine if legalization of physician-assisted suicide affected the rates of suicide, regular suicide, or what we call non-assisted suicide. And they found, and they came to the conclusion that actually the introduction of physician-assisted suicide seemed to induce more self-inflicted death than it inhibited. Which is interesting because one of the arguments that the assisted suicide supporters like Compassion and Choices make is that if we would have doctors painlessly end somebody's life who was terminally ill, that would keep them from taking their own lives. This study showed that it doesn't. And suicide contagion is something I've known about for a long time and talked about because once we have the idea of suicide as a good, and the idea that if you're suffering, you can do it, it becomes a whole lot more glamorous. And we've seen this in the media with the Brittany Maynard assisted suicide in California.
Yes.
She was portrayed as this beautiful newlywed and just lovely, and her family was supportive, and she did it. And that's extremely dangerous. It's almost like she was on a window ledge while she was considering it, and there were so many people saying, go ahead and jump.
That's right.
And that's really important. I have seen this personally with myself. In 2009, my 30-year-old physically healthy daughter died by suicide using an assisted suicide technique that she learned after reading the book Final Exit by Derek Humphrey, a proponent of assisted suicide. She had struggled for 16 years with substance abuse and other issues and had been hospitalized for suicidal ideation. She became suicidal. She's had treatment, over the 16 years. We've tried everything, rehab. And what was so incredibly sad about it is one of the last things she told me was that she felt that she was a burden on the family.
Yeah.
And that really shocked me because almost 50% of people who do commit assisted suicide list fear of becoming a burden on family or caregivers as a reason for choosing suicide, not pain. Pain is much lower down the list. And what was interesting with her, and tragic too, is after she died, 2 people who were close to her also became suicidal. Suicide contagion is better known as copycat suicide.
Yes.
And it's a well-documented phenomenon. Often the media coverage or publicity around one death, say Robin Williams, can encourage other vulnerable people to commit suicide in the same way, and that's what happened after my daughter. We were luckily able to save those 2 young people. But I've seen it up close and personal, is how devastating a suicide is on family and friends. I described it one time as an atom bomb being dropped on the family. And for some reason, we think that if it's done medically, it's okay. And it isn't. It still has a terrible effect. And it's interesting with the assisted suicide laws, there is no requirement that the next of kin be notified. And the cause of death is actually falsified.
That's
it's
right.
put down as natural causes for privacy reasons. So you have family members totally out of the loop who may never know what happened with their loved one and weren't there at the beginning to reassure the person of their support and help.
It's insidious. These laws are not closely examined, except by those who take the time, just how seductive they are and how misleading and how much they deliberately lie about the nature of the suicide. Regarding medicalized suicide, for the readers out there, there's an excellent book. It's still very, very accessible. You can find access online. It's called The Savage God, and it's all about suicide and the history of suicide. And it's by Edward Alvarez. And Alvarez has a whole chapter on medicalized suicide. And he makes exactly the point that you just heard. And that is, if it's medicalized, well, it doesn't seem like suicide. You just take a pill and you go someplace else. It's deadly. It's seductive. It is just as deadly as a revolver to your head, but it's not quite as messy. And so now it's easier to sell. And we have to realize just how evil these ideas are. They're swirling around you. They're swirling around the culture. We need you involved in this battle for our culture, in this battle of ideas.
To help others stand against the seduction of medically induced suicide, go to stopassistedsuicide.com. Life Matters continues after this.
Power. You're pro-life and you want to defend your position, but you're not sure what to say. That's pretty common. So get the facts you need to back up your pro-life position with the Power of 7 app. The Power of 7 gives you effective pro-life replies to 7 of the most common pro-abortion arguments. It's simple, it's easy to use, and it's free. Power of 7. Download it now at thepowerof7.org. The Power of 7, 7.org.
And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Welcome back to Life Matters. We're your program on the right to life, on the culture, and on the very real battle of ideas. I have a very special guest, Nancy Valko. Nancy, you wrote an excellent article about a television program that's currently running here in the United States and is impacting youth. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, there has been a very popular book called 13 Reasons Why. And it's about a young teenage girl who commits suicide and leaves videotapes for all the people that she basically thinks contributed to her suicide. And they feel terrible. They made it into a television series, and I watched it, and it was absolutely horrible. And what was even worse, and this recently came out, since that series was shown, there were 1 million more calls with suicide, more searches on the internet for suicide, just like my daughter. When she was thinking about suicide, she went to the internet and looked it up, and they did have an article that came out, and they said 1 million more than before. And according to the Centers for Disease Control, Our suicide rates have been increasing since 2000 after decades of decline. And you have to remember, Oregon, the first state to legalize assisted suicide, it was implemented starting in 1998. Suicide is now the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S., with more than 44,000 people dying by suicide every year, and costing our society over $56 billion a year in combined medical and work loss costs, not to mention, of course, the enormous toll it takes on family and friends.
That's right.
What we have here is a real healthcare crisis, but our crisis is a staggering and increasing number of suicides, not that we need more physician-assisted suicide laws.
That's right. And regarding your statistics, I want people to understand this, that it's in the case in California as well as Oregon and Washington. When those folks die on the death certificate, it does not list suicide as the cause of death. They actually list something else. It's phenomenal. So what Nancy is mentioning, those stats, those are the actual suicides aside from physician-assisted suicide. And you are seeing a dramatic change in our culture regarding suicide and specifically regarding the use of medicine. We've talked about it before, but one of the things I found when it comes to youth suicide regarding these 13 reasons, I believe that Courtney Love, and those of you who read my book know this story. She was the wife of Kurt Cobain, who killed himself years ago, the grunge rocker, who happened to also be in Portland, Oregon. And this was years ago. But Courtney Love was very emphatic in speaking to all of the hundreds of thousands of followers of Kurt Cobain and grunge rock. And she loudly condemned the act of suicide as only destructive, not only of Kurt, but of only hurting her and their daughter. And she was emphatic in its destructive nature, and in no wise did she ennoble it. That is how society has always effectively dealt with suicide contagion. That is why throughout history, you go back to Herodotus, the first historian, and suicide contagion occurs throughout history. But the only effective way to stop the contagion is to be very clear in condemning it and never approving it, much less legalizing it. So we're looking at a point in history where our culture is facing a precipice of death, wanton death, of using death as a medical tool. And if you're not prepared for this, your loved ones, who maybe they're ill, maybe they're not, but the message of suicide is deadly and evil, and you have to be ready to confront it and counsel people. You've actually been involved also in a nursing setting, Nancy, in counseling those who are suicidal.
Yes, I have both professionally and personally taken care of people who were suicidal, some of whom were actually even terminally ill. And to my knowledge, my daughter is the only one that ever went on to complete the suicide. I remember one woman who was terminally ill, and this was years ago with Jack Kevorkian. And a nurse called me, and she said, Nancy, because I always took care of the suicidal people, and she said, Nancy, can you talk to this woman? She's talking about killing herself. So I went in there, and she was terminally ill, and she said, well, I'm thinking about seeing Jack Kevorkian. So I took a break and sat and talked to her. Not that I didn't notify the doctor as soon as possible, too, because at least 90% of people who die by suicide have diagnosable mental disorders, which are not required, and even an evaluation in these physician-assisted suicide laws. But anyway, in this case, I talked to her, and she wound up changing her mind. The scary thing was, a few days later, some women accosted me on the floor, and they tracked me down, and they said, we are going to try to get you fired. And I said, excuse me? They said, my friend said you talked her out of committing suicide. You interfered with her right to choose.
Oh, my gosh. Yeah, that's the
True
culture.
Story.
That's phenomenal, Nancy. Thank you for interfering. And just so you know, folks, throughout medical history, that's what good doctors and good medicos, people involved in counseling, do, is you talk to someone. And I'm going to use this opportunity, whoever you are, if you're listening now, please, if someone mentions suicide to you, even if they're laughing, take it seriously. Nancy touched on this. Throughout psychology's history, suicidal ideation is recognized as the number one indicator of deep depression. And people can be depressed and be rather jolly. So don't be deceived if someone's kind of joking about suicide. Just go ahead and talk to them about it. Say, I know you're joking, but I want you to know that if you're feeling down, you should really talk to someone. It's the worst thing you could do. It only hurts other people. And they say, oh, no, I was just joking. That's fine. Then, let it go. But don't let it go without addressing it, because this happens a lot. And I've heard stories of people who said, yeah, he was joking about suicide last week. So please take it seriously. Sometimes you are the one. You're the barbed wire strand before the cliff for some people. And if you don't care enough and take enough action, lives again are at stake. We are in a culture where the laws no longer protect these people, where basically, the reason we talk people off buildings' ledges is not to keep sidewalks clean. That isn't why they talk people. An agent of the government, a fireman, a policeman, will even lie to that person to not let them commit suicide. But it's not to keep the sidewalks clean. It's because that person's life is valuable. And they are in a state of mind where they need to walk through and get counseling and rethink things. And it's critically important that if you're in a situation, don't just let it go by. Nancy, anything else on Contagion? We could talk a long time about it.
Well, one thing I would like to mention, if someone's not sure of what to do, there are suicide prevention hotlines out there. One is 866-777-6236. If you're a young person, ask an adult. Do not let it go. Notify somebody. If it's another young person, notify the parents. You can be the difference in saving that person's life. It's very important. When people say these things, you have to take it seriously, Brian. You're exactly right. But there's also another kind of suicide contagion. We don't call it that, but that is how medically assisted suicide, this physician-assisted suicide, there is a lot of push to get it expanded beyond just people with terminal illness.
Oh, that's right.
There's been talk of people with dementia and other conditions. And when you think about it, it makes sense. If suicide is a constitutional right, medically assisted, then who are we to say what suffering is enough?
That's right.
And we could have an even worse situation than we have today.
That's right, and that's been proven in Belgium, it's been proven in the Netherlands, it's proven in Switzerland, every jurisdiction. Think about what Nancy just said. If the laws, as they say here, say, that person's got 6 months of suffering left, why are we letting them suffer for 6 months? What about that poor rugger who's got 6 years? What about that person? So if it's compassionate to save someone from 6 months of potential suffering, well then, gosh, that poor other person. And I think that it's critically important that you recognize this is the pressure on the disability rights community. And that is that, as one California decision said regarding Elizabeth Bouvier, the judge said, and again, she was quadriplegic. This is 25 years ago. And by the way, she's still alive. But she sued for the right to dehydrate herself. And to make that point, the judge said, yes, she has this right because she's condemned to a life in a wheelchair. So in his mind, this was the most compassionate thing because she had the rest of her life that she was going to suffer. Well, she's still alive. And the reason I believe she's still alive, and this is what we see in the psychological analysis of these folks, they're looking for purpose and identity. She became a media star back then in the 80s. She was on every television set in California, and her right was given to her. She was somebody. And that actually helped her be affirmed, ironically. Well, she's still alive, but that law is still on the books. And so this is very, very dangerous. 6 months is very plastic. Any honest oncologist will tell you 6 months is very, very hard to determine. Many people can go into remission. But more to the point, if the motive, well, we don't want that person suffering for 6 months. As they have recently done in the Netherlands, they allow it for people who are alcoholics. They allow it for people who are tired of living, have nothing physically wrong with them. Once you open this Pandora's box and you say that there's a portion of society, whole class of human beings that you're allowed to kill, that class only grows. It only gets bigger and bigger. So you have to be aware of this. You have to be willing to fight it.
And as far as suffering goes, I have worked over the years with burn patients, oncology patients. I had a mother with Alzheimer's and terminal cancer of the thyroid who had a tracheostomy. I've seen pretty much everything. I have never once been even tempted to end somebody's life. And I made sure my patients died comfortably. It is there. We can take care of people, I guarantee you, without killing them. And like I say, as a nurse, and I do a lot of volunteer work, I will do anything for my patients except kill them or help them kill themselves.
That's right. And that's the historical standard of all medicine up until just recently. That since the Hippocratic Oath, that's what defined medicine, and that's what made doctors and nurses the honorable members of society we have held them in. But that's all changed. Nancy, we're going to have to let you go this time. I want to have you back very soon. But thanks for being on Life Matters.
Thank you, Brian.
You're listening to Life Matters. If you have questions or comments for Life Matters, call 800-924-2490. Give us your name and the town you're calling from and a quick question or comment.
Power. You're pro-life and you want to defend your position, but you're not sure what to say. That's pretty common. So get the facts you need to back up your pro-life position with the Power of 7 app. The Power of 7 gives you effective pro-life replies to 7 of the most common pro-abortion arguments. It's simple, it's easy to use, and it's free. Power of 7. Download it now at thepowerof7.org. The Power of 7, the number 7.org.
And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Well, as you know, we're Life Matters. We're your program on life, on culture, and the very real battle of ideas. And you know this, that ideas that are enforced are called laws. That's all a law is. It's some idea somebody cooked up, and then they put it into law, and they force it on people. So you have to be aware of these ideas. You have to understand them. I'm going to visit for a moment an idea that you heard a lot about. If you will recall, Sarah Palin talked about the death panels that were inherent to Obamacare, and she was scorned by the major media. She was dismissed as an alarmist. But I have to tell you that Sarah Palin was right. The federal government's desire through Obamacare was actually to limit and to control health care, to save money, quote unquote, and for everybody, because they were going to provide health care for everybody, and they have to save money. So that panel is called the IPAB, I-P-A-B, Independent Payment Advisory Board. Now, you know that President Obama has now left, but the law is still there. And the IPAB is still there. And under IPAB, even if they don't get bureaucrats appointed to this board, again, it's designed to have these unelected bureaucrats sit on the board to determine what kind of health care should be practiced in America. Again, not just what Medicare will pay for, but what anyone pays for in medicine, because the goal is to reduce the entire cost of medicine and the ongoing, quote-unquote, supposed increases that are making things so expensive, so they would establish a standard of care for independent payments. So that if something is very, very expensive, the federal government will say, no, that's not under the federal standard of care. That is not something that should be offered. Even if a doctor or patient would like that care, the federal government will control and monitor the standards of medicine. Now, why should the government control the standards of medicine? These aren't doctors. But here's what's even more ironic. This law was written so that even if there were no people on that board, it would kick in that the limits on what should be spent for health care, once they hit a certain margin, will kick in so that expensive care will be limited as a standard of judgment. So this federal bureaucracy, the IPAB, go ahead and look that up, Google it if you want, Independent Payment Advisory Board. It still exists. It's still in place, and Congress needs to specifically vote it down. Treatment that a doctor and a patient deem needed or advisable to save a patient's life or to preserve or improve the patient's health, but runs afoul of the imposed standards, will be denied, even if the patient is willing and able to pay for it themselves. So in effect, there will be one uniform national standard of care established by Washington bureaucrats and set with the view to limiting what private citizens are allowed to spend in saving their own lives. IPAB cuts will decrease access to health care for patients. It's a form of rationing. Please contact your member of Congress. Ask them to sponsor H.R. 849, House Resolution 849, the Protect Seniors Access to Medicare Act of 2017. So this is a critically important issue. Again, if you really want to be done with Obamacare, we've got to take it apart, and specifically IPAB. Some members of Congress think they can tweak Obamacare. If we don't take out IPAB, we're missing the point. The very heart of rationing is still there. So if you want to know more, go to nrlc.org, that's the National Right to Life Committee website, and find out about IPAB, Independent Payment Advisory Board, terrible part of Obamacare, and H.R. 489. I want to thank you for that. Please take action. Having knowledge is not enough. We must act on the knowledge we have. So we're here to equip you with knowledge and information about the battle for life, the battle of ideas, but then it's up to you to be a citizen and to act on this knowledge. So go to nrlc.org, that's nrlc.org, and take action on behalf of the vulnerable. If you're in California and you want to find out about California policy issues, go to californiaprolife.org. That's all spelled out, no hyphens. californiaprolife.org. We're the state affiliate of National Right to Life, and we'll give you the details on the policies that are cooking in your state. So thank you for that. Take action. The facts are on your side, and facts are terrible things to waste. The medically vulnerable, the innocent, are dependent on our care and involvement. Don't expect things to change if you don't change and take action. Thank you.
To help others stand against the seduction of medically induced suicide, go to stopassistedsuicide.com. Learn more about everything in today's show online at lifematters.life, where you'll find all the resources you need to protect life. Life Matters is a production of the California Pro-Life Council, the state affiliate of National Right to Life. Wherever you are in the nation, you can find out more at National Right to Life. You can find vital pro-life information and also find the access to your state and local Right to Life affiliate. Get informed and get involved.